for coming today. We're going to be talking about increasing working class inclusion within politics. So did everyone want to introduce themselves and explain a bit about your work? Did you want to say?
Hi, so I'm Chloe. I'm 21 years old. I'm a final year politics student at the University of Liverpool and graduating, I should be starting at Cambridge this September for my Masters. I'm a parish councillor for my local parish council, and I founded my own organisation called Our Voice Matters, which aims to tackle sexual harassment in politics. So yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Victoria Odeji. So I studied geography at Queen's College, Cambridge, so it was quite nice to come back. And yeah, during my time at university, I got very heavily involved with wider participation, access to outreach, education, and a lot of issues pertaining to social mobility. So during university, I ran a variety of initiatives, somehow managed to win some awards along with that. But I think for me, the biggest thing that I did do with regards to politics was signing up for a program called the Patchwork Foundation Masterclass Program. And it's basically a national program that supports young people from diverse backgrounds who want to get involved with politics. Actually, the slogan of the charity is called Get Involved. So yeah, supporting young people getting involved in politics. And that's provided me a variety of opportunities, one of them being doing an exchange program with the US Embassy in 2022, so visiting the US for 2 weeks, which was amazing. So yeah, very passionate about education, access, and also social mobility.
Hey everyone, my name's Mete. I'm Victoria's best friend's brother. They went to the same school, my sister. So I've got a couple of hats on. So I am a councillor in the London Borough of Hackney. So I'm also the cabinet member for climate change, environment and transport. So I oversee a brief of making sure people's bins are collected, streets are clean, our response to climate change, looking at strategic transport, energy efficiency, all of that. I also set up an organisation when I was a student called My Life, My Say, which is now the largest voter registration organisation in the UK. It's all about trying to encourage young people to participate in democracy, particularly those from black and global majority backgrounds. We work with brands like Apple, like Tinder, like Uber, Deliveroo, many different brands to get young people registered to vote. And it's all about going to where young people are. So similar to the work that Patchwork Foundation does. So really pleased to be here.
Thank you. I'm Rainbow. I'm more than 21 years old. I'm in awe of all the other people on this panel. Everyone else here practices politics. I research it. So I'm a professor of politics at Queen Mary University of London, and my research specialism is increasing diversity in politics. I've done a lot of work on gender, but intersectionally, so looking at the intersection of gender with other underrepresented groups, and I've done some research looking at working class representation in politics, which I think is why I'm here today. But yes, you guys do, and I talk to people who do. It's impressive.
Thank you.
Do you want some water?
And why do you think it's important to work to increase the inclusion of working class people within politics?
I personally think it's incredibly important, but it depends on what area of politics we're talking about. So in terms of parliamentary politics, there's an absolutely ridiculous disproportion between working class MPs and kind of like the more middle and upper class MPs. I remember talking to my friend who I used to volunteer with in our local party, and I remember her, she's like very privileged, very kind of upper middle class, and she said, I really don't think that MPs have to be working class. And that's one thing that's really stuck with me, because people don't realise, if you're not working class, how important it is to be able to see the world. So I'm the first person in my family to go to university. My parents both left school at 15. My mum got pregnant at 17. We've kind of seen the world in a different way, as opposed to kind of like people who have gone to Eton and kind of just progressed and were born to be MPs. I think being an MP in particular, you really need kind of the life experience and knowledge to be able to help the majority of the country, who are majority working class. I think if you don't have that experience, then it's a little bit futile to be an MP, because can you truly represent your constituents if you've not really had that experience?
Yeah, I think just to follow up, a really nice way of putting it is the importance of blind spots. In all areas of our lives, you always have blind spots. No one's going to be perfect. But I think there's a lot to be said about if you are working in an area where people's votes, people's taxes, count towards, making positive impact in your society, making sure those voices, like all voices need to be heard at the table. So I think, there's so much that needs to be said about trying to ensure that all representation in all forms is made very accessible. I think there's a lot to be also said about not clumping up all groups together, because there's a variety of working class experiences. Being a working class person who might have grown up in a council estate in inner city London versus being a working class person who grew up in Glasgow, or someone who might have grown up in Newcastle or in Devon. Those experiences can be very, very different. So I think having that representation is really important, but then also ensuring that a variety of identities are included in that is also important as well.
Yeah, I think lots have already been sort of said. I think the intersectional point that Victoria made is really important, and really recognising that, working class people aren't one big homogenous group. There are lots of different intersectionalities, and, myself and Victoria will face different challenges. Victoria's a young black woman, and, the challenges she will face in politics will be very different to what I face, although we've got very close similarities of both being from Hackney, working class from council estates. And for me particularly, why I was really keen on getting involved in politics was really around, my parents came here as asylum seekers when I was 2. I'm brought up in a place called Hackney. It's a very nice and trendy place to live in now. But when I was growing up, it had one of the highest rates of crime in the country. It had one of the highest rates of child poverty in the country. More than 36% of children live in poverty. I was one of 63% of 11-year-old pupils that couldn't go to school in my borough, because at the time, between 1997 and 2003, more than half the schools had shut down. And what got me really interested was when my local youth club, which was basically my second home, because that was where I used to go to after school when my mum's a care worker, dad's a cab driver when they're working late. It was the place that I would go to every day till 9 o'clock after school. And one day it shut down. And for me, I couldn't really I was just like, why is it that this place shut down and no one's caring or lifting a finger? And part of it was about looking at sort of some of our, like our local council, parliament, all of these things that we're talking about, and thinking, I'm looking there and there's no one who looks or sounds like me with my lived experiences. So in the end, I thought to myself, do you know what, it's really important that people from my lived experiences also have a voice in those decision-making institutions that have an impact. And that's why I ultimately, and I know that Chloe, similar to you as well, I used to be a councillor as well, because it's really important that we have, more working class voices in politics.
Thank you. A lot of research on this has all come to the same basic conclusion. If you haven't lived an experience, then you don't really get it. And so if you have a parliament which has an absence of people from a particular background, then the politicians making decisions on behalf of those people just get it wrong. And they get it wrong in more than one way. Because when you think of politicians getting it wrong, you think of politicians coming up with the wrong answer. But it's not just they come up with the wrong answer, they come up with the wrong questions, and they come up with the wrong diagnosis of the problem. So rather than understanding why people face particular challenges, they come up with their own interpretation of what they see as a problem. They frame it in a particular way that often demonises the people that they're actually supposed to be helping, and then they come up with solutions that reinforce their existing worldview based on their own lived experiences. And so people end up being excluded from the conversation, their preferences aren't taken into consideration, and often they end up being blamed for situations that are not of their own making and where they should actually be supported. To give one of so many possible examples, was when the coalition government from sort of 2010 to 2015 under David Cameron was trying to address issues of people on unemployment benefit, but stopped calling it unemployment and started calling it worklessness. And worklessness was designed to stigmatise people who weren't in employment, because workless sounds like worthless, doesn't it? And it sounds like people who are lazy and couldn't be bothered to get a job. And it simply did not recognise that people weren't in work because they had disabilities or because they had caring responsibilities, and that the cost of employment was, the cost of being in employment, where you have to travel to work, you have to pay for childcare, actually exceeded the salary that you would be able to earn from the position you're in. And so what this did was it really stigmatised people from working class communities. But then when those people were interviewed, they kind of internalised that stigma and were quite happy to reuse that same terminology, but towards people that weren't them, because it became just so ingrained in the national consciousness. So it's a way of sort of perpetuating inequalities, not just in terms of policies, but also in the way that you talk about people, the way you make people feel about themselves. And so to change that conversation, you need different voices in the mix, and that's really, really important.
What barriers do you think working class people specifically face when trying to enter politics?
So, speaking from my own experience as a parish councillor, I'm the youngest by quite a few years. And I also, obviously not as much as Rainbow, but I do a lot of research with my undergraduate studies about stuff like this. Being a councillor, especially a parish councillor, the time commitment isn't that much, but you don't get paid a single allowance. If you're a borough, district, city councillor, you do get an allowance, but it's still not high enough to be sustainable, basically. Obviously, it increases if you're like a cabinet member and stuff like that, but usually this is why councils are dominated by elderly people, because it's so inaccessible for young people, for working class people. I know that if I wanted to graduate university, I was considering maybe staying in Liverpool. If I didn't get an offer from Cambridge, I would have stayed in Liverpool and maybe ran for district council. I knew I wouldn't have been able to because the time commitment would be so much, but then not enough to live on. I think the average salary, my hometown, I think councillors get 12,000 a year in allowances, which is not a lot to live on. Definitely not enough. So I think just the way that kind of you're rewarded for being a councillor, you're kind of expected to do it out of the own merit of your heart. And it's the same with volunteering. A lot of the time it isn't accessible. And I think that really does need to change.
Yeah, I think that there's almost like quite similar parallels to almost like working in the charity sector. There's a lot of people who might come from a working class background and you might want to work in the charity sector to support young people who are from backgrounds similar to theirs. But because their pay isn't, particularly high, it then deters them from going into that career. So in my own experience, I mentioned in my introduction that I was on the Patchwork Foundation programme. So as an alumni, what I realised with being on the programme was how useful the programme was in regards to providing young people with opportunities to network with politicians. And then also kind of hear about the variety of career journeys, because oftentimes when you do meet politicians, MPs, those who are engaged with civil society, you have a lot of assumptions about their backgrounds. But I think it was always quite useful hearing somebody who had maybe a different background, who actually might have gone to a non-selected state school and then were able to kind of work their way up in either business or politics, and then give back to their community. So I think there's a lot to be said about providing accessibility. And then also the support. A lot of it's kind of tied to your knowledge and access. And I always say, you don't know what you don't know. And if you don't know it, it's not useful. So Patchwork Foundation has been quite useful in kind of encouraging young people who do want to get involved in politics, basically providing them with that support system, that network, to be able to enter very well into that area.
Yeah, look, I think some of the barriers have already been sort of alluded to. I think what I would say is that it's not that working class people aren't interested in politics or issues. Of course they're interested about whether they've got a decent roof over their heads or they've got a job that pays them basic respect or dignity. The problem is whether they see traditional forms of politics as a vehicle to address the issues they care about. And partly the reason why they don't is because one is we have a huge issue around education, the political literacy piece, which is that, unless the reality is, unless your family is from are a family of voters or those who engage with. I didn't know what a councillor was 6 months till before I stood to be a councillor, and I was someone who was a community activist and I was an engaged person, for example, and even I didn't know what that was. So the most general people don't really understand the intricacies of local government, national government, because we don't get educated about it. So the political literacy point is really important. The second key barrier is obviously representation. The fact that politics isn't representative of working class people. People therefore do not engage in a system that doesn't feel inclusive for them because they feel like that environment isn't for them. there's also issues around trust. You know, like, why would you engage in a system that doesn't fundamentally work for you, right? Like, people feel put off from that. But also, like, some of the practical points that, you know, Chloe was talking about, you know, like, the reality is the way the system is set up right now is, you know, you have to make, if you're a single mother, or if you're a young person, or if you're a person from black and global majority background, or if you're a person with disabilities, why would you go into a career, for example, which, you know, potentially can impact your, you know, like your standard of living, because you're not going to be earning a lot of money. So therefore, what then happens is people who are, I'll ask you all a question. Does anyone want to guess what the average age of a councillor in the UK is? Go for it.
78.
Do you know what? You're not too far off. It's in the 60s, so it's like 66. And that just shows you, you know, like the problems that we have in the UK, which is that, you know, the average age of councillors or MPs, I think, is in the sort of the mid-50s, is we're still some far way off being able to get true representation of, you know, a much more inclusive, and it's the same thing for, if you look at the number of women in politics in Parliament, at local government, we've still got a long way to go there. So I think there are quite a few barriers that stop. And then the other final thing that I would just say is the political environment. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you have been following the news recently, but you look at, for example, you know, the absolutely vile comments made by Lee Anderson towards the Mayor of London, the racist comments, you know, the political, you know, like, if you're a young person, working class background, of immigrant background, I mean, the political environment to enter politics now, like to put yourself, your family through that, it's very difficult. It's a very difficult environment. You know, it's a very changed environment where, you know, there's constant scrutiny through social media, TV, and for a lot of people, it's not really and if you don't have that right support network around you, like you said, Victoria, what then happens is people then, you know, they disengage from that system. So I think there's, you know, unfortunately, lots of barriers for working class people that stop working class people from getting into politics.
Thank you. You've all spoken really interestingly about local politics. The thing I know most about is running for Parliament. And obviously, if you get a job as an MP, you know, you get a salary of more than 80 grand, so sweet, that's problem solved, right? But the problem is getting into Parliament. It was calculated that the average cost of winning an election, like the cost of the individual, is almost £70,000. And you're probably wondering, what on earth would you be spending that money on? Because your main expenses, like publicity materials and adverts and all of that, get paid for by the political party. So why is it so expensive? The first thing, and this is probably the biggest barrier to working class representation, is the opportunity cost. That parties tend to select their candidates for Parliament years before an election. They don't want to get caught out. We had a couple of snap elections where they were having to select candidates at the last minute. They ended up with a few people they might not have chosen if they'd had more time to think about it. So they screen them years ahead. And then they expect you, once you've been selected, to start working the constituency, right? So you're expected to start putting in hours and hours for years ahead of an election to help all the electorate get to know you and think that you're a good bet. But that's time, and time is money. And every minute that you spend campaigning is time that you're not spending doing something else. So it's time you're not in paid employment, so you might have to pass up career opportunities, go part-time, that's lost income. If your initial income isn't high, going from not much to half of not much is not enough. And then if there were other things that you were going to do with that time, like looking after your kids, then you've got to outsource childcare. If you were going to spend that time cooking, then you've got to get a convenience food, which costs more. And those are all drops in the ocean, but they add up, and that biggest loss of earnings is a huge barrier in and of itself. And it just means if you haven't got savings, if you haven't got family wealth, then immediately that's a big problem. Another thing is that a lot of constituencies in the UK have incumbents who just keep getting elected over and over. So ideally, you want to get elected where you already live, but a lot of people don't have that opportunity. They have to look for a constituency somewhere else. But if you want to go and stand in a constituency somewhere else, you've got to travel there. You've got to go there, you've got to do the journey there and back. You might have to stay over in the constituency. That's all costs. And even to get selected in that constituency, a lot of people have to run for 10, 12 different seats before they get selected in one of them. So that's 10, 12 different times where you've got to do all the travel back and forth, get to know the people in the constituency, build up a reputation, establish yourself. That's time, that's money, and a lot of people just don't have that time, they don't have that money. Some people can't do that if they've got, for example, childcare or caring responsibilities within where they live. They can't just be going off somewhere else. I mean, imagine if you're a single parent, you haven't got someone else to look after your kids. How can you go off and do all these trips to somewhere else in the country? You can't necessarily just sort of uproot yourself and go somewhere on a whim. So that's a barrier. And then it's also just things like looking the part. I mean, some of the people that I interviewed, they said, you know, when you're running for Parliament, you're expected to look a particular way. So the party told me that I needed to get my hair done and buy a suit. But I work on a shop floor, I don't have a suit. And if I have to have my hair done every time someone, you know, one of the big names from the party comes to the constituency to boost my campaign, that's 30 quid each time. If I have to keep wearing the same suit, I've got to get it washed quickly, I might have to take it to dry cleaners. It all adds up. So all these tiny little things, if you've got a big wallet, become insurmountable barriers if you don't. So sorry, I know I've spoken quite a long time. There's more details that I could give that I'll pass over, but the point is that the actual entry barrier, and the final thing I'll say is, of course, you know, if you get that salary at the end of it, you can pay off all that debt. But a lot of people don't win their elections, and so all they end up with is massive amounts of debt.
What existing measures are helping with increasing inclusion, and what more do we need to do?
So I'll speak as my experience as a young person. I'm also a recent graduate of Patchwork. I graduated this a couple of months ago. And for me personally, even though I really, really loved the experience, one thing I kind of found issue with, and I think a lot of people did, it was extremely London-centric. And when I say extremely London-centric, they did not have a single event out of London. They also, the reimbursements, you had to kind of apply for stuff like that. So in terms of a programme for working class people, it was quite hard to actually get involved that well, and I found that people who were in London could often, you know, get all the opportunities and be rewarded because they were able to be rewarded and be able to chair the sessions and stuff like that. Whereas me travelling from Liverpool, finishing the sessions at 9 p.m, there have been times that I missed the train and I had to kind of just stay out all night because I couldn't afford a hotel and stuff like that. So I feel like there are programmes that are tailored to, I'm going to say, young working class people in politics. But there's so many different intersections that, as we've spoken about before, it's not a homogenous group. And maybe schemes like that are really good for people who live in London, are able to take evenings off. Whereas for me, like, some people would be like I remember I went to an event at Downing Street, I was speaking to one of the other people on the programme, and they were like, oh yeah, I just walked in, it was 30 minutes, and I had to set out at 1 p.m. for an 8 p.m. session, because just it takes so long, and then obviously having to get back as well. It would be a whole day thing for me. So I feel like, in terms of what we need to do better, just in terms of everything, is realise that people being working class is not just one thing, there are different things that go towards it as well. So one thing that I work towards is sexual harassment in political parties especially, something that I've recently left my own local political party because the sexual harassment and the way you're treated as a young woman was just ridiculous. I absolutely hated it. It felt like I was excluded all of the time, and I thought I'd much rather work as an independent and kind of not be limited by a lot of stuff. I feel like they need to recognise that there are different barriers that are worse for working class people. So, for example, a young woman of colour doesn't kind of see the world and politics as being young, being a woman and being a person of colour, but she sees it as all three at once. And I feel like that is ignored by quite a lot of things. So yeah, I feel like just more kind of thought into the barriers that working class people actually face, and not just kind of doing a one solution fits all, because as I've said before, my experience is I go to London every week and it's so expensive.
Yeah, I think, just like following on from what was just said, kind of just like that end attention to care with regards to intersectionality. And I guess, one of the beautiful things is just knowing that as time progresses, as more people who are from working class backgrounds get, especially young people, they get older and they get more involved. We'll be really interested to see what happens next with regards to what new organisations are created out of experiences from previous ones as well.
Yeah. I mean, look, those are like some really good points that have been made. I think what I would say, like Chloe's point about, you've got to like really, when you're setting out these initiatives, and it's something that I often have to challenge my organisation, My Life, My Say on, is it's the co-production and the co-design piece, which is around when you're creating these programs, it's like, where are the working class voices that actually are not just the beneficiaries of these programs, but actually are helping shape these programs, so you can actually have these considerations really built into it. So, for example, like with My Life, My Say, to plug us in, we do something called democracy cafes. So we have a traditional partnership historically with started off with Starbucks. The concept was basically you go around to different coffee shops across the UK, and you can have essentially a conversation of like politics or issues in your community over a frappuccino. We've done more than 700 of those outside in the UK since 2015, more than 80% outside of London. And we've that point exactly like Chloe. I remember we went to a place called in Blackburn once. It was like this really small cafe, like off a roundabout. And normally when we do these democracy cafes, we have like 30 to 40 people. There were like 80 people that turned up, right? And I remember the youth workers basically saying to us, they never get an opportunity to talk about politics. And this was like the height of Brexit. And they were like, they just like, even though we told them only bring 30 people, they were like, we couldn't stop them coming, because when they knew that, Nick Clegg was coming at the time, they really wanted to be there to get their voices across, because they never feel like they have that opportunity. So I think there needs to be much more we need to do to really get out to like sort of some of the rural communities, particularly where, young people feel like, they're very disconnected from Westminster. And then the final thing that I would say is look, there are lots of different programs that really do exist that are out there. I think what we need to do better at between like different organisations and different people working in the sector is basically finding a way where we could sort of synchronise these and make sure that, like, for example, like Patchwork do really good work, for example, when it comes to the training of young people. My Life, My Say does really good work when it comes to sort of like raising awareness around democracy. So how do you create a seamless experience where you could sort of like, you get someone get really enthused about politics and then you pass them on for the training and all of that. But really going back to sort of Chloe's point. But the one final thing that I would just say about this shouldn't be down to organisations like from the charity sector who are doing these work. Actually, it should be government proper resourcing it. So, like we're having to pick up basically what the government isn't doing, and we shouldn't normalise the fact that people aren't educated about how democracy works. I find it absolutely bonkers that we live in a democracy and we don't teach people about the system that we live in or how you engage in it. That is not normal, and that's how you end up with, stuff like Brexit, stuff like Donald Trump. The reason why you end up with that is because we're basically living in a system where no one's ever educated us about how decision making works. Like the EU, when we left the European Union, no one ever taught me about the European Union before we went to it. So how could you expect me to vote on such an issue that is so complex? The reality is the government, or any future government, has to really sort of see democratic engagement as a core function of its thing, and hopefully then, working class voices will be heard.
Thank you. I think three things. The first is culture change in terms of the expectations of wealth of candidates. Candidates at the moment are seen as a source of revenue or source of resource for a party. So candidates are expected to bring their own wealth into the campaign rather than being seen as people who need support. And it's stigmatising to admit that you need support, because you're supposed to be this self-starter who, if you need something, you're supposed to be able to figure out how to get it, rather than... And so what you're doing is basically stigmatising people that don't have independent wealth to begin with. And second, and relatedly, I think you need culture change to recognise intersectionality. So one example of that was, I told you how people had to travel to other constituencies, and some candidates were told, well, be resourceful, you don't have to stay in a hotel, find a party member whose house you can crash at. But it's easier to do that If you're a man and you're not worried about being sexually harassed at someone else's house, it's easy to do that if you don't have a disability that can make it awkward to stay in accommodation that isn't appropriate. So it's not necessarily as self-evident as people coming from a position of privilege might think it is. And last but not least, we've got to make campaigns shorter. People shouldn't be having to give up 4 years of their life to run a campaign. When I spoke to people who campaigned in the snap election, they got selected in a week. They then had 5 weeks of campaign for the general election. They just took it as annual leave. They didn't lose their jobs or their income. It was great. But when they had to do it for 4 years, it was an insurmountable barrier and it put them off. So maybe we need to get rid of this culture, which isn't backed up by evidence that it does any good for an election anyway, that people have to be campaigning for years. And maybe we just say, right, 5 weeks and we're done.
So I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. So I know we've spoken about intersectionality before, but what can we do to include the voices of working class people who face intersectional disadvantages within politics? For example, people from ethnic minorities, care experienced people, women, etc.
So I'm currently doing my undergraduate dissertation on women in the Labour Party specifically. Very more specifically why in about 101 years we've never had a woman leader. We've only had, I think, one person of colour. And through that I've kind of done a lot of research on women in political parties. Obviously one really bad thing is sexual harassment. The power imbalances in political parties mean that I know a lot of people who have been sexually harassed, for example, by older party members, by councillors, by people running for elections. And because politics and parties are so much about like point scoring and kind of winning elections, they don't care. So let's say someone gets harassed by a member who is kind of running for an election as a really good activist. I've known of situations where it's just been ignored because they'd rather win the election than have, like, let's say a young woman kind of like ruin their chances of winning a target seat or something like that, which I've always said, if it's a target seat, you don't need a sexual offender running for it. Like, that's actually going to do you more harm than good. So that's one of the reasons why I personally kind of left party politics, because I can't stand the toxic culture of it anymore. And then also, kind of in more a parliamentary sense, there's been a lot of research onto women and running for leaders and stuff like that. So across Europe, I think it was, there was a study done by some researchers, and they found that women are more likely to lead parties that aren't likely to win, or they're more likely to lead kind of like the opposing party or be deputy leader, especially in Labour. That's kind of a big thing. It's always the man is leading it and the woman's a deputy. And then, so you've got that, and then, yeah, so the only time that women are more likely to kind of lead a main party is if the original party leader has been kind of like expelled because of applying like a scandal or something like that, and then they see it fitting for a woman to take the place. Because of that, women have very different standards to men in any aspect of political parties. So you kind of got it in a systematic way like that, and then also from my own experience, kind of like harassment and the way women are treated in particular. And then also you've got everything else like disabilities and stuff like that. So I suffer really badly with my mental health. And I like to think I'm quite open about that, especially online. But I've had a lot of people say you shouldn't, because kind of your career and reputation is going to be ruined if they know you have borderline personality disorder, for example. But it's not going to fix the fact that I do have it, whether I talk about it or not. So I feel like people have got so many different really bad barriers into entering politics, and I feel like politics, if you have a look at the House of Commons, is for a very specific type of person. And if you do make it, then you'll probably feel really alienated anyway, and I think it's a really big culture thing that needs to change.
Yeah, I think it's like quite like a big question. I think a lot of my experiences are probably more tied to the local level rather than the national. So I think I'll probably speak more about my own experiences. But I think the biggest thing that is really useful is just the importance of, oftentimes, you know, it's about getting someone to vouch for you. And oftentimes the best person to vouch for you is someone who's in a position of power. And oftentimes that doesn't necessarily, you know, those people who are in positions of power tend to look quite similar. And so it's almost like someone's political career is on, you know, it's basically being dictated by how well someone likes you, and if they, you know, think your political views are in line with theirs, and if they can basically see themselves in you. And oftentimes, you know, all humans, irrespective of where you live in the world, you know, people tend to see themselves in others, it can be quite tied to like, physical attributes, not just, personality or, what comes out of your mouth or, other characteristics in regards to your tenacity or your determination. So it's just like trying to kind of, change who is able to kind of pull the lever. And unless that really changes fundamentally over decades, and obviously that's going to take decades, then everything else on the grassroots level is not going to change as much as we think it will. And I think with kind of everything we've kind of discussed, as much as there is a lot of encouragement for working class people to get into politics, with regards to what Mete mentioned about the political state of the country, and especially on top of that, looking at social media, it's not necessarily the most inviting place for people, like you mentioned. So there's a lot to kind of think about with regards to if someone is going to put their career on the line. You're devoting yourself to politics because you believe in the power of positive change for your society. You believe in people. Just understanding there's just so much that you kind of need to think about as well. So I don't think it also relates just down to the individual. It's more to do with that system and how you go about trying to change that system. And even though that change might take decades, just ensuring that we are kind of working towards that bigger systematic change. But then also ensuring that everyone's on board. I don't think there is any issue in society where it's down to just one person. Everyone needs to care about it in order for positive change to happen.
Yeah, I mean, look, your question is about how we can get more working class people into politics. I mean, the question is also like, what is working class? That's another important question that we haven't really spoke about, because often people, I'm from a working class background, right? Like my parent, I'm brought up on a council estate, I went to a convent school, I was on free school meals, my parents are asylum seekers, I tick probably every box of being, working class, right? But I'm also very conscious and aware that the way I was brought up is very different to how I am now, and I've moved on into and I'm no longer living as a working class person. I have working class experience and lived experiences, but I think there's the definition of being humble and recognizing what you are, and I think often the other thing is as well, I don't think anyone working class calls themselves working class. That's the other thing. I often find the way people talk about working class people in a weird way, it's it's this weird fascination and romanticization about working class people. And I always say people like my mum and dad don't want to hear that life is rubbish, right? Or when I was growing up, I didn't want to hear life. I became numb to it. What I want to hear is, what are you going to do to get me or my family or my children? I don't have any children, but us from here to there, right? You want to move on and do better. You don't want to be paid for. You don't want to be told, things are bad for you. So I think we need to think very, very radical about this. And I think we need to really think through, political literacy. Ultimately, if you want to empower generations and working class people, be it women, be it all these different groups that we're talking about around the equality groups, we need to firstly make sure that the population is educated about how democracy works and how we can hold politicians and decision-making institutions to account. Without that, fundamentally, you can never achieve change at a scale. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think we need to be looking at, for example, reform, democratic reform. So we need to really think through about the way in which we do democracy, right from the chamber to how our electoral system, for example. We haven't really spoke about that, but also our electoral system is quite disenfranchising for large proportions of our population, and people don't vote because of the way the electoral system works as well in that regard. Or, for example, the fact that we still vote. We talk about working class, but you vote from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. right? Traditionally, 50 years ago or 30 years ago, the working day was 9 to 5. The working day is no longer 9 to 5 in the modern world. People have different shift patterns in terms of the work. They have to travel for work. So actually, should we move the actual election day to a weekend over 2 days like they do in many parts of Europe? Do we make the actual election day a public holiday? Do we have online voting? We need to update our democracy to make sure that it's actually fit for the working class to actually engage, because people's shift patterns have changed. And then there are other things that you can do, when it comes to the conversation, for example, we spoke about women in politics. I actually think one of the great things that the Labour Party done was when they introduced the quota for number of women in politics. And I think what that done is significantly, made sure that we had all women shortlists, for example, where we got to now, I think we've got more than 50% of women in Parliament. But again, the problem with quotas often is that it creates a level of complacency, right? So you've got to be careful. So I'm not saying the quotas are the answer. It may be a good first step. But then the question is about how do you define that? So like what I would want to see is that people of colour have the opportunity, for example, to have that opportunity as well, where we could increase that option. So like quotas can be a good first step, but the danger is if you get relaxed on quotas, because I've seen it in the Labour Party, for example, sometimes, or people say, oh, we've got to select one woman out of 3 candidates. And it's like, it's not just one woman, you can have 3 women. Like, it doesn't just have to be one, we can have 3. And so the danger of quotas, it sort of can get you relaxed, but it's a good first step to get that radical change through the system. And I think that's why it probably is done better than other parties when it comes to sort of like parliamentary representation. But I'll stop there.
Just to clarify for the record, women are now more than half of the Labour Parliamentary Party, which is, I think, what you meant. Yeah. But not more than half of Parliament. They're still less than 30.
Oh, yeah. No, it's exactly that, yeah.
Yeah. Because a lot of people overrepresent the representation of underrepresented groups in Parliament. So just to clarify. So one of the things to bear in mind when you're thinking about the intersection of class with other identities is that there are different barriers for every type of minoritised identity, and they can be cumulative. And one of the ways in which they're cumulative with class is that I mentioned earlier that if you want to get into politics, you're probably going to end up getting into debt for it. And that is a massive commitment, and you really need to believe you're going to get something out at the end of it. And if you are also facing discrimination because of who you are, if you're facing abuse online, if you are placed in a seat that your party doesn't expect you to win just so that you can be a symbolic candidate, you are incurring all of those financial barriers for what? To get abused, to lose. It adds up. And related to that, one of the key things that you need to make it in politics is you need a support network. It's really, really hard to do it alone. A lot of people rely on support from family. Sometimes that's just psychological support. Sometimes it's just someone telling you can do this. And if you don't come from a background, if you're not one of the kids that goes to Eton where your dad was an MP and you, so, there's all that expectation, you might not have anyone tapping you on the shoulder saying, you know what, you can do this. And then people who might want to go for it, they might not have people who are necessarily encouraging them. There's much more risk aversion when you don't have a financial safety net. So there's much more fear about getting into debt when you don't come from wealth. And so there might be people more hesitant to take on that risk because they're more worried about the consequences. And that can also intersect with other identities. Just to give one example, I'm supervising a PhD student. She's a female Muslim counsellor, and she's doing a PhD looking at barriers to Muslim women in politics. And one of the issues is Baradari networks, which are networks of Muslim men. It's like a brotherhood who help each other out, and that can work as a closed circle. And there are opportunities for women within the Labour Party, and there are opportunities for Muslim candidates, but often the two don't meet. And so Muslim women fall through that cracks, and the Labour Party doesn't really want to mess with the Baradari because they have been very good at mobilising Muslim votes in certain constituencies, and they don't want to be sort of feeling like, it's sort of white people telling other people what to do. But at the same time, there's a group of Muslim women there who feel like they haven't been supported from either side. So it's often not one simple one-fits-all solution, because as other speakers have said, every person is an individual, and the particular challenges that they face are the combination of their individual circumstances. And so I think we should be wary of just sort of trying to come up with a generic solution.
Thank you. Does anyone in the audience have any questions?
Yeah, it's kind of a comment and a question, if that's all right. I just first want to thank you all for your time. These are such vital solutions that I really appreciate all of them. So I volunteer with a group called the Class in Clinical Psychology Collective at Classical on Twitter, or X, whatever it's called. So aiming to widen participation into the clinical psychology profession for people from working class and minority backgrounds. And there are, well, yeah, because clinical psychology as a profession is dominated by white middle class women, but this is not reflective of the majority of NHS mental health service users. So we try and put forward really specific actionable things to try and help these access. So for like training courses, trying to pay some out like honorary positions that people normally get because they don't know about people, and not university studies and things like that. Are there any really specific actionable things like that that you think we can put in place to help improve access to politics?
I would personally say, and this is probably quite obvious, but listen to working class people. I feel like a lot of kind of like working class outreach programs are often kind of made by people who don't really have experience in it. And obviously I don't have experience in psychology, I'm a politics student. But I feel like the most actionable thing you can do is listen to the people who are going to be affected by the issue. And then they can tell you exactly what the barriers are. Because also a lot of the time the barriers are quite outdated. So a lot of places will like work on stuff like, let's say, young working class people into politics, but it'll be a very outdated way of going into it, and it won't be helpful to anyone. So I would say listen to the people and kind of like your service users and make sure you kind of go off on that. So for example, kind of a little bit different. So over the most recent summer, I did an internship at the University of Cambridge where I stayed at Gonville and Keynes, and I worked at the Institute of Criminology, and it was an internship for working class students to kind of be introduced into kind of postgraduate life. So we had socials, we went to formals, but then we also worked full time within the department. And one thing that they did really well was that at the end of it, they constantly listened to our feedback. And now this year they've kind of changed this. They've changed the length, they've changed kind of where they're located, where they live and stuff like that, and they really took our feedback aboard. So even though I really enjoyed it, I'm really hoping that the next session for next year's cohort, because they've kind of actioned on our points, it will be a lot more effective. So I'd say make sure you genuinely listen to kind of what you could do better, what works well, and kind of like, yeah, make sure you listen and make sure you action that.
Yeah, I think from my own knowledge, more so to do with like the university, higher education sector, but then also to do with schools. The Social Media Commission has their own toolkit on the website, and they've got some really, really useful tools when it comes to how organisations can better support young people from more working class backgrounds. So that is a very good resource that I'll definitely point you towards.
Yeah, I mean, look, just very briefly, I think very important question, but I'm very sort of supportive of, I think, Chloe's suggestion, which is, I think it's the co-production, co-design of what you're actually planning to do, because often, it goes back to, what you were saying earlier about like the assumption that we have an approach in one part of the country or what's worked well with one group that may work for well with that group. You're never going to know that until you actually work with the people who you're supposed to be actually serving, for them to shape what you're actually doing. So I think the actual actionable step for you is really, like actually working with, the people you're intending to help with, and not only just getting them to design it, but actually getting them to lead that peer-to-peer engagement among those communities, because ultimately a lot of this comes back down to trust as well. Like often, like for example, myself, like when I was growing up, if I was talking to someone, and that's what I was talking about, representation being a barrier to working class people getting in politics, is that when people approach me to talk to me about being a councillor or to get involved in politics, there was a straight barrier there because of the way our lived experiences were. So I didn't really trust what they were saying to me, because I don't really know if they understood where I'm coming from or what their intentions were. Whereas if it's someone who looks and sounds like me, has a similar lived experience, there's automatically a trust there as well. So I think what you do want to do, and research shows, is that peer-to-peer engagement and getting them to be the front and centre of the work and the project you're working on. I think it's really important.
I'd say invest in people. There's this ridiculous culture of politics at the moment that you can't give financial support to candidates because it's ridiculous. If you're running for Parliament, you can't receive any money from your party for your living costs. But if you're the campaign manager for the same candidate, you're on the payroll. But the candidate has to do it for free. And nothing good comes for free. If you want people who come for free, you're going to end up with Jacob Rees-Mogg. So you need to get over that and realise that you need to support people. You need to invest in them. And I think I've got 50 small suggestions, all of which two sort of many micro details to go into here. But often it is actually about the micro details because, as I said before, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So it's also, I think, about having a conversation. What do you need that can make this feasible for you so that you can achieve your goals? Oh, and one last thing as well. I think the way that we do training is wrong. Generally, the way that we do training, I think, for most equality stuff is wrong. We do a lot of training of people who are minoritised in how to deal with being discriminated against. We don't call it that. We call it how to advance your career or, how to be more confident, whatever. But it's basically how to deal with being discriminated against. And what we actually need to be doing is training privileged people how to stop discriminating against other people. So we need to change the way that we train people. But that's beyond this particular question. That's a big bugbear of mine. But
I think I'll just add on to the point Mette mentioned about representation. There's a really nice quote that I like by a children's rights activist in America called Marianne Wright Osmond. And the quote reads, you can't be what you can't see. So I think there's a lot to be said about the importance of positive representation, how life-changing it is. I mean, even for my own journey, it's not really tied to politics, but for me coming to Cambridge, I am the second person in my school to ever come to Oxbridge. So having that representation, it wasn't in school, but it was on social media. Having working class students who had come to this institution and were sharing their journeys on YouTube, it made a difference. So there's a lot to be said about sharing those personal stories because people fundamentally are more than just statistics. They're stories, and people connect with stories more so than that.
Is there any other questions?
At least where I live, there's a feeling that London gets everything. That even the struggling, the poor, and the dispossessed in London are focused on more by the Westminster government and everyone in the north of England, where people often feel ignored completely. This feeling may not be correct, but feeling exists. We've all seen the political consequences. What would you suggest the best method would be to ensure that working class people in the north are finally able to feel like they have a say in the running of this country? And how would you ensure that those in often overlooked regions don't feel left behind in our governance?
So I really agree with that because I'm from Birmingham and I studied at the University of Liverpool, so I've lived there for 2 years now. And I think that there's something so special about the north, especially Liverpool. I absolutely adore it there. Compared to London, no offence. I think it's just so much nicer. People walk fast and you don't need to stand on one side of the escalator. My first time ever I didn't leave from London. My first time ever going to Liverpool, I arrived there and I didn't even need to ask for help. I had so many people coming over to me and being like, oh my God, are you okay? I had people giving me tools and just randomly in Liverpool, and it was incredible. So what I've seen as someone who studies politics kind of in the north, I think there should be more devolution, and I think there should not be as much power in Westminster as there is, because Westminster is a bastion of kind of corruptness and the power is in the hands of the wrong people. I think with more devolution we can kind of put my own politics in place as well. Local government should have so much more power because that's how we kind of see the more measurable impacts on actual people, as opposed to, I feel like it's usually just an echo chamber in Westminster. I feel like people are arguing about stuff. Like if you have a look at the chamber during the MP's pay rise, it's obviously going to be full. If it's a debate on kind of SEND provisions or like kind of care leavers or anything like that, it's always empty. I feel like with more devolution to local government and more powers, especially, so for example in Manchester, I think Andy Burnham's done such a good job with just kind of most things around that. With more devolution and more power to local governments, people can be more empowered no matter where they are, because I also think even if there's kind of more schemes for young people to move to London, I don't want to move to London, and I think that's a really important thing. A lot of organisations kind of ignore that and realise that I think it should be okay to want to stay in your hometown, and I really do think that's ignored, so yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, look, just to pick up on that final point, I think that, I mean, I'm a proper Londoner. You can tell from my accent. Everything to me outside of like the M25 is the north of England. But you know, one of the things that like through my work with My Life in SA, and often when I do speak to people from the north of England, is that sense of feeling where like they feel like at some point they're going to have to think about moving to London if they want to access opportunities, and you should not feel like you have to move to London to access opportunities. By the way, I should just say as well that if you live in London doesn't also mean that you have loads of opportunities to you. Like Westminster is also very disconnected from like the community that I'm from, for example. And I think one of the things that really I find very disingenuous about this current government, and I'm sorry to be like very political about it, but is how they pitch communities against each other and how they pitch cities against each other. Like the idea that you have to level down London to level up the rest of the UK, you know, we should be seeking to be able to prosper all parts of the UK. But I do agree that we need to find, exactly on Chloe's point, is we need to find a way where people aren't growing up thinking, you know, at some point, you know, I'm going to have to move to London to be able to get a good job or to think about building a family. We need to think about how do we really share that economic power. But ultimately, that's going to come down to that exact point you made around devolution and sort of the sharing of the power, that, you know, decentralizing some of the power from Westminster. Because ultimately, how could you possibly know what's the best thing? Like, how can I make it? Like, if I was to be, say, elected as an MP and I was a parliamentarian and I'm going to make a decision in, for example, that's going to impact, you know, like Manchester or Liverpool, how could I possibly understand their lived experiences and what's best for people that live there? I don't. And I think what needs to happen is that we need to give local authorities, and this is one of the experience that I have as being as a councillor and as a cabinet member, is we need to give, you know, since 2010, a final point that I make, local government since 2010 has lost 60p in every pound, right? Right now, most councils across the country, a lot of them, some of them are starting to go bankrupt, right? And most councils are in charge of things like adult social care, you know, like your local transport, your SEND provision, all of these sorts of things. And right now, a lot of councils are making difficult choices of cutting nurseries, children's centres, libraries, and it's because they've literally have got zero, like, you know, they've lost 60p in every pound in the last 10, 13 years. So I think, you know, the way we got to things, we've got to rebalance, and that's one of the key things that I'm really passionate about, is how do you change, although we don't have a formal constitution, is how do you have democratic reform so you actually devolve powers and we don't end up with this like bizarre system where we have, which is that the reality is that that place called Westminster is very disconnected from, not just from, you know, the north of England, but actually, you know, even from London.
Speaking owning the fact that I'm a middle-class white woman from London, but also political scientist, and part of the problem that we have is our electoral system, that means that a lot of the seats that we have are safe seats that are owned by the incumbent who keeps running again and again. And when one of those seats becomes vacant, it's gold dust. Everyone wants it. And so to get a chance of getting one of those safe seats, you've got to be on the inside. You know, you don't wait for it to be announced on social media that the seat, you know, the candidate's standing down in the next election. You've got to be on the inside and have that advanced knowledge, which privileges career politicians, people who move to London to build their career. They work as a political aide or assistant, or within the party, or within an NGO within London. And then once that seat becomes available, they get parachuted out to it. And so for one thing, they're disconnected from the area. For another, there's also that class barrier again, because we're talking about people who can afford to do sort of political intern jobs and who can then afford to run out to a constituency when they hear it's available and start building their lives there. So we need to break that pattern and have more people who actually come from a constituency, who live the lives of the people that they're representing and can speak authentically for them, rather than people who have built their careers in London and then jumped on the first opportunity to go and represent a constituency somewhere else.
Are there any more questions?
You earlier on you touched on like the importance of networks and politics itself. And, you know, in the past, working class people were able to access Parliament and the higher levels of politics. You know, by volunteers societies, trade unions, churches, and mechanics institutes. And as we've seen, the decline of all of those voluntary institutions, we've seen the decline of accessibility for working class people by those means. Think of Jim Callaghan as the Labour Prime Minister. Didn't go to Oxbridge, rose to a trade union, up to be the leader of the party. So I just think to myself, for the future, where do you see that force in society coming from? That voluntary force that uplifts working class and marginalised people into politics the same way those institutions did so in the past, but they don't do so now.
Can I just? I think people, it's changed now. Politics is not like how it used to be, like maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. There's a lot of people now who I sense that, really are crying out for authenticity, right? They're crying out for people who just, I think people appreciate honesty as well. I think one of the things that put off people from politics, right, is that the idea that you make promises, you're going to, and it's very normal, by the way, you can make a promise before an election, you get into power, and then you actually say, do you know what, maybe we're not going to be able to deliver on this promise we made, but actually it's going back out and being honest with people. And I think the British public and most people would appreciate the honesty. I think the problem is that we have is that there's this political class that we've been talking about, a way of doing politics, a way of getting into it, and it's so disconnected. We done a poll recently with My Life, My Say, and with Opinion. 53% of young people do not trust politicians, hardly surprising, right? 76% of young people believe that Westminster is corrupt, right? 49% of young people believe that the decisions that are being made by politicians and government favour the interests of businesses over young people, right? The point I'm trying to make to you is the sense of feeling that we have across communities in the UK is a sense that, people want change, people want authenticity, and actually, one of the things that worries me most, and we saw this with Brexit, is that the far right tap into, people's sort of emotions, particularly around sort of the loss of jobs or what the concerns around the NHS. And actually what we need authentic leaders to emerge. So I actually think that, we need to go back to sort of strengthening our trade union movement, because they're fundamental, it's really important for people like my dad, who's a cab driver, for example. But equally it is as well that I think we're going to get to a stage, right, where unless you do have the authentic voice, I just think either people will disconnect or they just won't vote for you. So I feel quite optimistic, and I know, when you look around everything around, it feels like, politics is feeling more and more disconnected. But actually, I think that the feeling among the public, the fact that they want that change, eventually at some point there is going to have to come that point where we're going to have different voices that are going to emerge in politics.
Anything to add? And just to round off the evening, what's next for your work, and do you have any specific plans surrounding the general election?
So I'm currently focused on trying to get the grades for Cambridge and decide on which course to take. So I have 3 offers and I am really stressed out over which one to choose. So that's kind of taken over my life at the moment. For the general election, literally last week I left Labour, so I'm much more freeing now. I think I'll still vote for them, but I just couldn't give any more money to kind of be involved in such a corrupt political system. So for me, in terms of practical politics, I'm hoping I should be fairly okay. I think I'm just focusing on my academics now, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I think for me, more probably tied to civil society. I've actually got a podcast launching next month, and so I kind of came back from my own inspiration when I went to America on the exchange program. I really loved meeting, community activists from across, Florida, Washington DC, Detroit, Milwaukee, and I think I've always been very inspired by the stories of the ordinary people. Oftentimes in society, the stories that you read in books, the stories that you see on TV, the stories that you see represented, the voice that you often hear are those of the minority. I've always been really interested in, yes, you can have a podcast like Diary of a CEO, you can interview someone who's got a multi-million-dollar business, which is fantastic, but why not interview your neighbour who's also got a very interesting story? Those stories matter, and things like trying to, demystify stories like that, and then also making them normal and pushing them out there. So I think those stories also need to be heard. They're also important in my opinion.
Yeah, I think for me, with My Life, My Say, we're launching a campaign called Give an X for the general election to get every single young person registered to vote. So it's doing 3 things. One is working with brands that have got a high reach among young people and actually going to where young people are. So, just recently, for example, we launched a collaboration with Premier League football clubs. So Fulham, for example, in their matchday programme, they had a QR code where you could scan it, register to vote. We're working with Lime Bike, for example, the bike company, so they're going to do Lime to polls. So if you're aged between 18 to 30, you'll get a code. You can go to the polling station and vote for free. They're also going to do an in-app notification. We're also doing the same thing with Apple. We're talking to Ben & Jerry's. We're talking to loads of different companies and going to where young people are. Also working with influencers, celebrities, in that space too, like people like Minya Chihuahua, who's an Instagrammer, people like Amelia Dimmeldenberg and others too. And then finally is the work that we're doing across sort of the more sort of frontline facing sort of youth sector organisations. Some of the more traditional ones like UK Youth and the NCS and others, but some of the more micro organisations that have got those trusts in those communities. So I'm really, really pumped for the general election because I think that ultimately we need to get young people voting, because without young people voting, politicians aren't going to take us seriously. And if you look at the big issues of the day, whether it's climate and this government sort of pulling back on sort of its climate commitments, the issues around housing, the fact that the reality is that most people nowadays, it's being normalised to rent a room. Like not even to rent a property, and that should not be normal in a country that is supposed to be the 7th richest or top 7 richest countries in the world. There are so many societal issues that are going to impact young people, and we need to make sure that our voices are heard.
I'll be brief. I've got a research project coming up looking at marginalised men in politics, including how working class men are represented and misrepresented.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you again for our panellists.